Hello everyone. So in this video, we will be going through question number 2. So I would suggest you to go through my previous video on PLSQL before jumping into this one, because this question which I'm about to solve, the one which you see highlighted on your screen, this question is related to the previous one, is related to question number 1, where I had created a table called student, inserted 5 records, and updated the grade attribute for every student. Now in this question, question number 2, I'm being asked to go through every record of the student table that I've created already in question number 1 and print these values. You can see that for every marks category, that means if the student scores 90 and above, then I have to print outstanding. If the range is between 80 to 89, then I have to print excellent. For 70 to 79, I have to print very good. For 60 to 69, good. Otherwise, it's a fair performance from the student, which I have to display. Now, since the table is already created for me, what I'll do is I'll show you what my table content looks like. So I've already written the statement. So select star from student. This will, star means you get all the attributes and you will get it from the student table. So you want the values of all the attributes present in your student table. So that's what I've done. So this is the content of my table student. Now I have to write a PLSQL code which will examine every row for the marks attribute. It will examine the marks attribute of every row. For every record, it will examine the marks attribute and it will print the corresponding statement, the corresponding grade expansion. That means O stands for outstanding. So I have to print outstanding if the mark scored by the student is 90 or above. And if it's between 80 to 89, then it's excellent, and so on. So what I'll do is I'll jump straight into the code. But before doing that, remember, if you have to display anything on your screen using PLSQL code, you first have to set the server output. So I'll write set server output on. If I don't do this, then I won't get any output statement on my screen. In order to enable the output buffer, I have to write this statement. So what I'll do is, like I showed you in the previous video, I'll write my code in a notepad and I'll execute it in my PLSQL command prompt. So let's get started. So first thing that I need to do is I need to declare a few variables. So what are the variables that I need? See, I need one variable which will keep a track of the number of rows which are present in my table. So I'll have a variable called number for storing the number of rows, and its type will be integer, of course, because here, although I know, as you can see, that there are 5 rows in this case, but what if new insertions take place and the number of rows increases? Then my program, if I write my program with respect to 5 rows, it will no longer work. That's why, in order to generalize my PLSQL code, what I'll do is I'll always try to find the number of rows present in my table and proceed accordingly. Now, I need another variable called student marks. So I'll have to store the marks of every student of every row. I'll examine every row for the marks attribute and store that marks attribute in a variable, and that variable will be checked according to these ranges that you see here. These ranges that you see, these ranges have to be checked for the marks value. So I'll declare my variables stud marks and it will be of type integer, because every mark value that is present in my table is of type integer. And I need another variable called loopvar, which will help me to loop through every record, and I'll initialize it to a value of 1. Now, so all my variables have been declared and initialized under the declare section. Now for the statements which I want to execute, I have to start the begin block. So first thing that I'll do, like I did in the previous case as well, in the previous example, what I did was I found the number of rows. So in order to find the number of rows present in a table, there is an aggregate function called count star. So if I do select count star from my table student, from my table student, you see I get a value of 5. So this gives me the number of rows which are present in my table. And how many times do I have to iterate in my loop? I have to iterate 5 times. In this case, it will be 5. Why? Because there are 5 rows. So had it been 500, I would have had to iterate 500 times. So this count star will denote the number of records or the number of rows present in my table, and that will determine the number of times I have to iterate my loop. So what will I do? I will store I will store the number of rows present in my table in a variable called number of rows. So this is my variable. So I'll store the number of rows in a variable, and for that I'll use the into clause. So select count star. So whatever output you're getting from the count star aggregate function, you store it in the variable number of rows. And you're talking about the student table. Okay. Now, after this, after you have the number of rows, you have to iterate through every row. So you have to iterate over every row. So you say while loop var is lesser than or equal to number of rows. Now, this will enable you to run through every record, every row present in your table. Now, once you start your loop, what you need to do is you need to extract the marks attribute value for a row. So I have to extract the marks attribute value for the first row in my first iteration. In my second iteration, I have to extract the marks attribute for the second row. In the third iteration, I have to extract the marks attribute for the third row, and so on. So now you can see that I can identify every row uniquely by the SID. I can identify every row uniquely by the SID attribute, because you can see that SID has a unique value for every row, and SID also happens to be my primary key. So now what I'll do is I will write a statement which will fetch me the marks attribute of a particular row. Now, which row am I talking about? Okay, before going into that part, in which variable will I be storing this marks attribute value? I'll be storing it in stud marks. So using the into clause, you can store your SQL output in variables. So I'm storing my marks attribute for a particular row into my variable stud marks. And I'm doing this from the student table. I'm doing this from the student table, and will I be doing it for all rows? Obviously not. I'll be doing it for one row at a time, and I'll be doing it for that row where the SID matches the current loop counter variable. So my current loop counter variable has a value 1. See, my loop counter variable is loop var, and it has a value of 1 to start with. So I want one row at a time. So it will check which SID attribute value, which SID value, or let's say this way, for which row does the SID value match with the loop counter variable? For which row does the SID value match with my current loop counter variable? So in the first iteration, since the loop var will be 1, it will match with the first row. In the second iteration, since the value of loop var will be 2, it will match with the second row. In the third iteration, the value of loop var will be 3, so it will match with the third row, and so on. So that's why we give this condition. This condition helps us to extract only one row at a time. Okay, now after I have the marks with me, I need to check the bracket. I need to check the range in which the marks lies. So I'll say if stud marks is greater than or equal to 90, then I'll have to print out, right? I'll have to print. So if stud marks is greater than or equal to 90, I will simply print. So for printing, we have the statement DBMS underscore output dot put underscore line. So using this statement, I'll be printing out outstanding, because if a student scores a mark which is 90 or above, I'll have to print outstanding. If you remember from the range that has been given to us, 90 and above means outstanding. So I have to print outstanding. Now I have to check the remaining ranges in this way. So I'll say else if the student marks is greater than or equal to 80, and the student marks, sorry about that, student marks is lesser than or equal to 89, then I'll have to print excellent. So I'll simply copy paste this. Let me just copy paste this part and make the necessary change. So I'll say if it's between 80 to 89, I'll print excellent. Similarly, for the other ranges, I'll do the same thing. I'll write else if statements. So I'll say if it's between 70 to 79, then I have to print out very good. I'll have to print out very good. If it's between 60 to 69, if it's between 60 to 69, then I'll have to print out good, right? If I remember the range, yeah, 60 to 69 is good. So I'll have to print out good. And otherwise, if you notice, otherwise I have to print fair. That means if the mark of a student is anything outside these brackets, it has to be printed as fair. So I'll simply say else. I can use else, right? Because else means it does not match with any of the previous conditions. So if it doesn't match with any of the previous conditions, it will come to the else part. As it has been asked in the question that if it doesn't match with any of these categories that I've written here in these few lines, then I have to print out fair. So I'll simply say the grade is fair. And after I'm done with my if statements, my if else if ladder comes to an end, I'll end off my block with end if, and I'll of course increment the loop var by 1. So the loop control variable will be incremented by 1 so that I can process the next record in my table. And after I end of my loop, I'll say end, I'll give a semicolon, and of course I have to give a semicolon at the end of end loop as well. And finally I'll say forward slash. And now what I'll do is I'll simply copy this code and I'll paste it in my prompt. So let me clear the screen for you. And now let me paste it. Okay. Now fingers crossed, let's see if we get the correct output. And yes, now see what are we getting? We are getting excellent, outstanding, very good, good, and very good. Just check out the values that you have from the student table. So select star from student. Now see, now it's 80. If you remember, if the mark is 80, then it has to be printed as excellent. And it has been correctly printed as excellent. For the first row, I have printed excellent correctly. The next row has a mark value of 90. And if it's 90 and above, then I have to print outstanding. See, in the second row, I've printed outstanding. In the third case, it's 70. If you notice, 70 to 79 is very good. So the third row has rightly printed very good. For the fourth row, it's 67. 67 means in the range of 60 to 69, and I have to print good. And that is what has been printed. And the last row, I have 79. So it has been printed as very good. So what I've done is I have been successfully able to print out every grade meaning, right? This O stands for outstanding, E means excellent. So I've successfully printed the meaning of every grade. Now I've done this on the marks attribute. I've done this on the marks attribute. You could have done the same thing using the grade attribute. So you can treat this as an exercise. What you can do is you can modify this program so that instead of working with the marks attribute, here you can see I've selected marks. So instead of working with the marks attribute, you can also do the same thing with the grade attribute. So you can try that on your own. If you face any difficulties, you can leave a comment in the section given below. And if you have any doubts regarding this video, or if you want to give me a feedback, please feel free to comment. Thank you. I'll see you in the next one.